or 45 minutes, and then see what you all have on your minds. First, a few definitions. There's been an awful lot of talk from the beginning as to the extent to which we thought we were dealing with Iranian moderates. And the one and only accurate definition of Iranian moderate that I've heard comes from Art Buchwald, who defined an Iranian moderate as an Iranian who was temporarily out of ammunition. And this corresponds almost precisely to my own experience from them. It is impossible to understand this affair without trying to sweep away a lot of the debris that's been generated by the press coverage and the huge personalities that are involved in this story. So I want to take a look at 3 or 4 of the basic myths that have been created about this Iran affair and the related Contra issue, and then try to focus your attention on the personalities involved and how it was that this thing actually happened. The first and most important personality in all of this is, of course, the president. And the president turns out in practice to be almost diametrically opposite the image that the world had developed of him. The world imagined that Ronald Reagan was a tough guy, a violent anti-communist, looking for ways to take apart the Soviet empire and to sabotage Soviet interests around the world, and on the subject of terrorism, fight tooth and nail every terrorist that he could lay his hands on. Well, in reality, if you take a look now, we have 7 years' worth of Reagan presidency. It turns out that he's almost totally the opposite of all of this, because with the one exception of Grenada, he's at no time really tried to directly challenge the Soviet Union, had to be dragged kicking and screaming to support the Afghan resistance and to challenge the Senate on the Clark Amendment. It took him several years, even though a lot of his top advisors, including Secretary of State Haig, wanted to challenge it right away at the beginning. Aid to Savimbi didn't start till really seriously into the second term. And on the subject of terrorism, the sum total of American action against terrorism in 7 years, which is the subject on which I devoted most of my time in government, was 1 bombing raid against Libya, which was a good but not a great thing. And then we got lucky one night on the Achille Lauro affair when we found out that the people, the terrorists from the Achille Lauro, were taking an airplane from Cairo to Tunis, and we were able to hijack them and bring them down at a NATO base in Sicily. That is not a glorious record, nor is it the record of a person who was particularly aggressive in this area. Indeed, where Ronald Reagan's passions emerge, and emerge most clearly in this case, is in romantic episodes where he can see clearly individual people involved in either heroic or desperate enterprises, whether it be hostages in the hands of nasty terrorists, whether these terrorists be in Lebanon or in the Lubyanka prison in Moscow, or heroic Contras fighting evil Sandinistas, or heroic followers of Savimbi fighting against nasty Cubans and Russians and MPLA nicks in Angola. That kind of situation is one in which he can project himself and in which, over time, he gets passionately involved. So the first passion, and the basic passion, that drove the Iran initiative, beginning to end, was the passion to get the hostages freed in Lebanon. And there's an interesting footnote here, because, again, if you read the general literature or listen to the commentary on it, people will tell you that this was a unique mistake, and it flowed, as the Tower Commission put it, from Reagan's bizarre kind of presidency, a hands-off, laid-back Californian, not deeply involved in managing affairs, and so people were able to do things and the president really wasn't up to speed on it. Well, this particular mistake of getting overly involved in the hostage matter is one that was already made by an Israeli government headed by Menachem Begin and Ariel Sharon, about which no one could say that this was a laid-back, hands-off kind of California government. I mean, no one would call Ariel Sharon a hands-off Minister of Defense, and was then repeated by 2 successive French governments, first under Mitterrand and then under Chirac. And Chirac did it even after having had the chutzpah to conduct a campaign against Mitterrand, in which he said that the worst thing Mitterrand had done was to prostitute France by trying to negotiate for the release of French hostages in Lebanon. And within hours of having become Prime Minister, Chirac then did exactly the same thing And in fact, one of the deals that the French government offered Iran was so generous that one of the Iranians said to me, the only thing they didn't offer us was Madame Mitterrand. And they didn't offer it because they knew that we weren't interested. So that when you try to understand how all of this happens, I think that you have to think structurally. You have to, this is a general problem, not a specific one. It does not flow from the personality of a single person. It is part of the problem of Western democratic societies. Turns out that these are all leaders who made the fundamental mistake of listening to the hostage families. And again, a lot of people like to approach this thing cynically and say, no, they did it for electoral gain. They thought that if they got the hostages out, there would be a political payoff. They would be reelected, or there would be a Republican Congress, or. I must say that this argument may be true, but I don't understand it, because I have yet to see a case in which public opinion really got involved in the thing to the extent where the release of hostages would have been an enormous political plus. In the case of France, for example, whenever hostages are released, it is greeted with the total indifference of the French public. And when Israel last made a deal with Jibril for the release of these 4 non-commissioned officers in exchange for more than 1,000 terrorists in Israeli jails, public opinion was absolutely violently opposed. So that if there's any kind of political payoff on this process, it would seem that any Western leader ought to have learned by now that it is minus, not plus. And that where there are political points to be earned in this kind of procedure, it comes from standing tall and being tough and saying, well, it's unfortunate and a terrible thing, but we will not bend to this kind of blackmail. Now, so it couldn't have been that. I think it comes from human emotions of listening to these families, because every one of these people, Mitterrand, Chirac, Begin, Sharon, and Reagan, all listen to the families. And it is very difficult to resist when people walk into your office and say, Mr. President, you are the only person who can save my son, my father, my husband, my man. Do something. And every last one of them promised that they would. And having promised unaccountably, they felt obliged to keep their promise. And then they went ahead, and each one of them has the equivalent of an Oliver North working for him, and called in the poor devil and said, Oliver, get those hostages out. And then to whatever degree of imagination, initiative, energy, and creativity, every one of them went to work stirring up private channels and secret contacts and hostages and ransoms and payoffs and bribes. And every one of these countries has gotten involved in them. So myth number 1 is that it did not stem from the unique characteristics of the Reagan presidency. And indeed, Reagan turns out in practice to be in many ways the opposite of what his public persona has been portrayed at. So that's number 1. Myth number 2 is that somehow all of this was part of a grander design to establish a secret government which would conduct the real American foreign policy, while the one that was being fed to the public in the Congress was being carried on in front of their eyes. What happened here is the end process, the end of a long process, which started back in the early to mid-1970s and has culminated really under the Reagan administration with an unprecedented torrent of leaks and vital secrets being given out to an unbelieving world. Now, I want to make 2 or 3 points about secrecy before I talk about this, because secrecy is the most commonly misunderstood subject in government. Most people imagine that the reasons why people want to keep secrets are because the secrets are embarrassing to the governments that are trying to keep them. This is rarely, if ever, the primary reason. The primary reason to keep a secret is because you want to be well informed. And in the real world, people do not speak their minds if they expect that what they say is going to be carried tomorrow morning on the front page of the New York Times or the Boston Globe. They will then pick their words carefully. They will not be candid. And candor is what government needs to make good decisions. In order to ensure candor, you have to be able to ensure secrecy. People have to be able to talk confident that the stupid things they say are not going to be repeated, not going to find their way into the media. Otherwise, they're not going to talk candidly. And this is true in spades if the candid things they have to say are sensitive. That is to say, people's lives are also at stake. So that when a foreign leader comes to talk to the President of the United States or to the Secretary of State, let's leave aside the question of the Director of Central Intelligence for a moment, but just the kinds of routine conversations that heads of state and heads of government have with one another in the world. People will not speak their minds to the President of the United States or the Secretary of State of the United States unless they can be convinced that this secrecy, this discretion will be maintained. Now, increasingly, since the mid-1970s, secrecy and discretion are not maintained. And consequently, it should be no surprise to you that the American government is having a harder and harder time finding out what is really going on in the world. Governments do not share secrets with us anymore. Again, to take my own field, so much sensitive information hemorrhaged out into the press in the latter 1970s that European police forces and military units and intelligence agencies stopped sharing with the United States some fundamental information about international terrorism because they simply were not willing to put their sources at risk and at the mercy of the Washington Post and CBS News. So that the United States was just desperate for the most elementary and important reasons to stop the kind of leakage that was passing from governments into the media, simply to be in a position to have the elementary information that we need to conduct our policy at all, let alone start to do the kinds of things that a lot of other people wanted to do in government. So that the secrecy that attached to the Iran initiative grew out not a desire to have some kind of secret government, but simply out of an initiative where secrecy had to be maintained if the thing were to have any hope of success. And as you all know, if you just think back to the Kissinger démarche to China, now they're very different things, and I don't entirely agree with those who have tried to compare them. But if you think yourself back, or look back rather, at the atmosphere when Kissinger was in the White House, and imagine what would have happened in this country if it had been revealed before the deal was consummated that Kissinger was dealing secretly with what we used to call Red China. The Republican Party would have risen in a rage of indignation and denounced him for being some kind of communist agent and sabotaging the interests of the country and selling out national interests and abandoning loyal allies and all the rest of it. It could not have been done. And for whole categories of basic diplomatic initiatives, you cannot do it if it's done in public, and you cannot do it if pieces of it emerge into the public. Now, what had people learned by 1984, 1985 about what leaks in the American government? They had learned that the State Department leaks. It's really an understatement. The State Department pumps. CIA leaks. The State Department is more a torrent than a leak, and it's because, I can even explain the mechanism to you, there are too many people at the State Department, and there's not enough work to keep them all gainfully occupied. And so, having so much time on their hands, they look in desperation for something fun to do, and they find that there's another category of person in the building with them who suffer from the same problem, and that's the journalists who are down on the second floor. So the people with nothing to do in the department get together with the people who have nothing to do in the press room, and this is what produces a great deal of the information flow. So State Department leaks, pumps, CIA leaks. Pentagon is much more reliable. Pentagon is actually capable of keeping secrets. And the NSC, by and large, was able to keep secrets. And that is why, when it came to both the Iran and the Contra initiatives, that to the extent that it was possible, contrary to the conventional wisdom, the CIA was not informed. My instructions from McFarlane from the beginning were under no circumstances discuss this with anybody at the CIA, because the CIA was so prone to leakage. The State Department, of course, it went without saying. The only place where this information started to be shared at a relatively early date was with the Pentagon, because the Pentagon was reliable. You could trust them. They kept their mouths shut. So it is not so much a plot on the part of the government as a rational response to a very real problem, and a problem that needs to be addressed. Because while it is true that one wants to have the widest possible discussion of policy in order to arrive at the sagest decision, If that policy cannot be formulated because of leakage and because people are going to bring it to the public if they don't agree with it, then it is probably better to have a narrower discussion, because at least you have the option of doing the thing where the wider discussion will shut down the policy in advance, no matter how wise it may turn out to be. It's a very real problem, and it's something that we're somehow going to have to find a way to address. At the moment, it grieves me to tell you that things are getting worse rather than better. People are talking more rather than less. And in the course of the analysis of the Iran affair and the investigations conducted, the greatest hemorrhage of all has taken place. I think there is no document in American history which has gratuitously revealed so much real secret information to a public which really didn't need it and wasn't really particularly interested in it as the Tower Commission report, where they actually went out of their way to publish such sensitive things as Iranian terrorists with whom we met in an effort to try to find out what Iran was doing in the world of terrorism. And the guy that was introduced to a member of the American government who was thoughtfully named in the Tower Commission report is now vanished from the face of the earth and is either in the basements of one of those awful prisons in Tehran or is in some premature grave. But this is the kind of consequence that the kinds of policies that we're pursuing in the public information field will have. So this is the second thing to which we are responding, and I insisted it's a rational response. It's a very real problem. Myth number 3 is that somehow or other we're dealing with a cabal inside the White House that was operating to the political advantage of the president. And here I want to come back and analyze the thing for you one more time from a slightly different angle. I was special advisor to Haig in 1981 and 1982. Haig went nearly mad. Some people think he went thoroughly mad, trying to convince the president to take aggressive action against Cuban and Nicaraguan activities in Central America early. Because Haig argued that if you didn't do it early, you weren't going to do it at all, and the later you waited, the greater the price was going to be that you had to pay. And for those of you who don't know it, in November of 1981, at the meeting at which the Contra policy was presented to the president and approved by the president, Haig spoke out against it on rather prescient grounds. He said, either the thing will work or it won't work. If it works, it had a dual objective. First of all, it was going to impede the flow of weapons from Nicaragua into Salvador, to the Salvadoran guerrilla movement. And secondly, it was designed to shift the focus of world attention from Salvador to Nicaragua, so that the political debate, instead of being over, was Jose Napoleon Duarte a fascist, which was what a lot of people were saying at the time, could make the debate over, were Daniel and Humberto Ortega communists, which is what the debate really has been about ever since, because the policy, in that sense at least, succeeded. Haig said, if it works, what will happen is that people will join this movement, and you will get a military movement against the Sandinistas, which is too big to hide and too small to succeed, as you'll never remove them with this method. And in the end, when it becomes public, we will be compelled to abandon them, just as we have had to abandon all these other people, from the Vietnamese to the Shah of Iran, for the last several years. And that is the worst of all possible outcomes. Therefore, he said he was against the policy. What he wanted to do was to challenge Cuba directly at the beginning. Well, as it turned out, this was a White House which had no stomach for any of these things. Didn't want a blockade of Cuba. Didn't want to really full-scale push for support of the Contras early when it might have worked. And the biggest joke of all is that the Contra movement that they got was not one that was anticipated by anyone, and which was a real problem for them once they got it. Because I have a chapter in this book I'm writing called Dewey Meets the Dialectic, which is about how the Contra movement got going. Dewey Claridge, one of the most talented people in the CIA, was instructed to go down and create some paramilitary units that would harass the Sandinista shipment of weapons from Nicaragua and Cuba into Salvador. And he started to do this, and within a year found that he had between 5,000 and 10,000 people who were pouring out of Nicaragua to join his movement. Now, this movement that he was creating was one that was being trained by Argentine generals and organized around former members of Somoza's National Guard to a great extent, not entirely. The people who were pouring out of Nicaragua and who became the rank and file of the Contra movement hated both the Argentine generals and the Somocistas. They had nothing to do with either one of them. They were something which, according to the traditional political categories, could not exist. It was a pro-American, anti-communist, spontaneous campesino movement. I mean, these things were supposed to belong to the Maoists, not to us. All of a sudden, we had one. And what do you do with it? Well, while you amuse yourself with the intellectual problem that these guys at CIA were trying to solve, and it was really very entertaining, imagine what testimony was like before select oversight committees in Congress, where these poor CIA people would go in and say, well, we're up to 15,000 people. And, we don't exactly know what to do. And one senator would say, well, you control them, of course. And another senator would say, they better not control them. Because on the one hand, the Congress didn't like the notion of CIA having 15,000 men in the field somehow connected to them and didn't control them because they might do something for which the United States might be held responsible. On the other hand, the authorization for the action to harass Nicaragua didn't call for this kind of phenomenon. Suddenly you had a mass movement that wanted to destroy the Sandinistas altogether. What was one supposed to do with it? So this is what happens when foreign policy outstrips the prophetic capacities of the people who draft it, because you got something which was really quite spectacular and is quite spectacular to this day, because the Contra Movement is growing again. Contrary to all expectations and all the predictions and all of the analyses, both by government people and the journalists, people are getting stronger all over again. And it is because you have a genuine peasants' movement, not just in Nicaragua, but in all of Central America, of which the Contras are simply a symptom. It is part of a much broader phenomenon, which has actually been driving for a kind of universal land reform program and the politicization of the campesinos from Guatemala to Panama. That's one of the most interesting things that's happened, and one of the most disappointing aspects of this whole story is that no one has become fascinated by it. And a footnote for the university, ever since I have been in college, this is now much too long ago, 1958, Latin American studies has been a real junk area of the American academic universe. The worst professors are in Latin American studies, and always have been. And the quality of work that we do in this field, in this country, is really abysmal. And in the end, if one wants to have better policies, we're going to have some better experts. So if any of you are going to go into Latin American studies, I'll salute that. I think it's one of the most urgent requirements that we have right now. Just astonishing how little we understand about countries which are so obviously so important to us. Well, anyway, so the Contra business was not anticipated. The movement they got was not the one that was designed. The people who were supposed to create this thing had it very quickly escape from their control. And you had a whole world out there which was not expected, not anticipated, and which was doing its own thing quite aside from the desires and predictions and policies written back in Washington. All right, so this brings us to Iran itself. And here there are 2 or 3 other myths. The first is that somehow all of this began because the United States wanted to do something, either get the hostages free or have an Iran policy of some sort. This business was neither an American initiative nor an Israeli initiative. It was an Iranian initiative. The entire impetus for the entire operation came from Ghorbanifar. Ghorbanifar was an agent of the Prime Minister of Iran. He proved it to us over and over again. Basically, the picture that Ghorbanifar gave us at the beginning about Iran and the various factions inside the country that were in conflict with one another has checked out and has proven to be accurate. And this brings me to myth number 2, which is that Ghorbanifar was either an Israeli agent or the most despicable person in history or one of the greatest liars of the 20th century, or perhaps all 3 or some combination thereof. Of all the bad raps that people have taken in this case, the worst rap is the one that's been taken by Ghorbanifar, because Ghorbanifar, so far as what he was called upon to do, did fine. I mean, from my standpoint, and I was the first one to meet with him and worked with him for several months, my interest was not to see whether he could pass a CIA polygraph, which is one of the least productive exercises in the world. What I cared about was 2 things. Could Ghorbanifar put me in touch with the top people in Iran? Because that was interesting and important. And the answer was yes. And that's checked out. And the second was, did Ghorbanifar have information about Iran and an understanding of Iran, which we did not have, and which we could use to translate into some kind of useful policy? And the answer again was yes. I did not want my daughter to marry him. That was not the point. I didn't care what his moral virtues were, nor did I care what he did with his spare time. Those were the two things that I wanted from him, and they were the two things that he delivered. And furthermore, one of the most outrageous claims that people have made in this entire affair about poor Ghorbanifar was that he was such a great liar that when he went to the CIA in 1984 and said that he thought he could get Buckley out if they just worked with him, and they polygraphed him and concluded that he was lying, and it was on the basis of that polygraph that they put out the burn notice. Well, we all know now that Ghorbanifar is first class at getting hostages out. Because to date he's gotten out Weird, Jacobson, Jenko, one German, and reportedly 6 Frenchmen. Well, that's not bad. So that we know he can do. Some of the other statements that he may have made about himself may be questionable, but we know for sure that he's okay at getting hostages out. That channel he's got. Indeed, it is Ghorbanifar who is the source of the greatest insight that we got from this entire affair, and that was that contrary to what everybody believed, everybody, it was not Syria that controlled hostages. It was not independent crazies in Lebanon who controlled hostages, but it was the government of Iran. And that the government of Iran could, all by itself, arrange for the release of hostages. Now that, intellectually and practically, was a major breakthrough. Nobody believed that. And it was not until the Reverend Weird, or Weird, as I shall forever think of him, came out in September of 1985, and I call him Reverend Weird because he came out at his press conference and denounced America and Israel, being these two awful governments with awful Middle East policies. After all, we just saved his life. And he praised his Shiite captors as having treated him with great respect because they'd only kept him in solitary confinement for a year. And if it's true that the NSA actually intercepted all of the telephone conversations involved in this affair, somewhere they have mine with a high Iranian official when I called him up and asked him if he wouldn't take this man back and give us an American instead. Anyhow, Ghorbanifar then was a useful person. And it was the rejection of Ghorbanifar and the way he was thrown out of this thing that brought the whole thing to collapse. Because the one thing that you could never do, and it must be rule number 2 or 3 in the CIA's primer of how to run an agent or how to run a covert operation, was to take in this operation the one person who knew everything. Because Ghorbanifar, one of the curious features of all of this is that Ghorbanifar is the only person who is there continuously from the beginning to the end. Nobody else. Everybody else comes and goes. McFarlane comes and goes, Near comes and goes. Even North doesn't arrive until relatively late in the story. But they then took Ghorbanifar, who was the key to everything, and just brutally threw him out. Said, goodbye, we don't need you anymore. Well, Ghorbanifar genius, if you can call it that, from the beginning was to have realized that you could only do this thing with the Iranians if all the factions in Iran agreed. So Ghorbanifar carefully went from one faction to the next, keeping everybody informed and giving each one a slightly different account of what was happening so that each one would feel that it was in its interest to participate. This was, of course, not a good American approach, so that when the CIA took the thing over in 1986, they threw him out, took a single channel, walked right in the front door, established a contact with Rafsanjani, and did it with him. Well, Iran couldn't stand for that because all the other people who had been involved all the way along said, holy cow, the Americans are going to cut us out. They're doing a deal with Rafsanjani. We better do something. So they put out the story that Rafsanjani was doing this horrible thing with the Americans, and that is where it came from, whether it was Ghorbanifar himself, who put the investigative journalists at Al-Shura in Beirut to work on the story, or whether it was one of his friends, I don't particularly know, nor is it important, but that it was provoked by that event was absolutely clear. Now, where were the criminal activities in all of this? In my opinion, there are 2 or 3 criminal acts, but they're not criminal in the sense that the investigative committees or the special prosecutor uses the word criminal. The most criminal act in the Iran initiative was the failure of the American government to pursue the one and only serious aspect of this, which emerged in the autumn of 1985, and that is when we started meeting with dissident Iranians, some of them in very high positions of the Iranian government, who claimed that they wanted to remove the Khomeini regime and replace it with something more pro-Western and more moderate. Now again, I remind you that I only use the word moderate in connection with Iran as an adjective and as in a relative sense. That is, the policies that these people said they wanted to enact in Iran would have been more moderate, relatively speaking, than the ones pursued by the Ayatollah Khomeini and the present crowd. These men are not moderate in any normal English language usage. They are religious fanatics, but they are better religious fanatics than the religious fanatics currently in charge of the place. Many times, indeed most of the time in policy, you do not have a choice between good options and bad options. You have a choice among a variety of rotten options. And the choice of the least rotten option is a legitimate and important foreign policy decision, and this was one of them. Anyway, I met with these people, and this is the story they told, and I did not know, nor do I know to this day, whether what they had to say was true or false, whether it was a deception, a scam, or a cri de coeur, whether they were really reaching out to the United States, desperately trying to change a situation which had gotten hopelessly out of hand. What we do know about Iran today, and what we knew about it then, was that life in Iran is a nightmare. It comes very close to the Hobbesian state of the war of every man against every man. People being killed in the streets, including ayatollahs and mullahs. A place where the regime is so frightened of its own army that it keeps the army at the front all the time, because if it ever enters the cities, they are certain that the military officers will rise up against the theocracy and try to replace it with a more Bonapartist sort of affair. A place where food is now in short supply, where inflation is runaway and all of that. To be sure, the effects of both hunger and runaway inflation are not nearly so dramatic as they turn out to be. I remember when I was covering Italy for the New Republic in the mid-'70s, I developed the theory that there was a level of inflation beyond which no democracy could survive. And that sounded good, and I wrote it a few times, and it looked great too. And after all, we all know about Weimar with the wheelbarrow full of money, and that's what brought down Weimar, a lot of people thought. And then I started to look around, and I saw Israel was running inflation pretty close to 1,000% at a certain point, and then Argentina and so forth. And a lot of these countries actually became democracies with runaway rates of inflation. So I must tell you in all candor that this marvelous theory that I had for several years, that democracy can't withstand runaway inflation, I no longer believe. And in fact, I'm increasingly convinced that there's actually no correlation whatsoever between politics and economics of any sort. And that if you want to see the extreme case of this kind of theory, it's in one of the funniest books ever written, one of the most important studies of philosophy of history, Karel Čapek's War with the Newts. Karel Čapek, by the way, is the Czech writer who in the 1930s invented the word robot and wrote a lot of very funny stories. War with the Newts, I'll give you a short digression. It turns out that the newts, which are giant salamanders in the South Sea Islands, get recruited by local fishermen to do oyster hunting for them. So the newts eat the oysters and give the pearls to the fishermen, and this good symbiotic relationship goes forward and develops into a great friendship. And so man starts to study the newt, and it turns out that newt has a fascinating mating ritual whereby when the full moon comes out, the male newts gather on the seashore and have a virtually obscene kind of dance. And at the end of the dance, they hurl themselves in a frenzy into the ocean, leap upon the female newts and mate, and then offspring are born sometime later. So scientists go to work on this, and they take the sperm of the male salamanders without the dance and put it into the water with female salamanders, and the female newts lay fertile eggs. And then they centrifuge out the solid stuff and just put the environment of the sperm into the water with the females, and they lay fertile eggs. And then they just isolate the females altogether and do nothing whatsoever, and they still lay fertile eggs. So it turns out that the mail was irrelevant to the thing all along, but they had to go through every one of these stages to arrive at the obvious conclusion. And I mean, you have to read it to appreciate it, because in the meantime, it's not only this, but Marx goes and Freud goes and all the rest of them go. It's really wonderful. And so you have to go through a lot of these stages to learn what idiocy, economic determinism really is. I mean, people can put up with untold misery. I mean, we haven't begun to calculate. You know, the political system's just much more important. Look at the Soviet Union. I mean, in any Western society like that, the place wouldn't exist anymore. It'd be torn apart top to bottom, and yet undoubtedly they can put up with a lot worse, and soon will. And so it is in Iran. We don't know what the misery index of the place is, and it's not clear how long it could stand. But these people, it seemed reasonable to assume that these people were reacting to a real problem, and they had grounds for their position. So I went to McFarlane and I said, here finally is something serious. We've got to check it out. And now he, poor man, run headlong up against all the real problems that he had. Well, number one, there was no CIA. So he couldn't turn it over to them because they were not in a position to evaluate this. The whole thing had started because the CIA knew nothing about Iran, so I was dispatched to try to find out something, and I met this character, Ghorbanifar, through the Israelis. To turn it over to CIA would mean, A, they didn't know enough to evaluate it, and B, it was now going to leak so the thing would come to an end and all the rest of those things, so he would have to find some other way to do it. This at a time when he himself felt increasingly driven to the margins, was thinking of resigning under pressure from Donald Reagan and all the rest of it. Rumors were being spread about him. It is, in short, the time when McFarlane's nervous breakdown either happens or begins. He freezes and never made a decision and never followed it up and never told anybody about it. So when, several months later, I couldn't stand it anymore, and I went to Weinberger and told him what had happened, he leaped half out of his chair and said, "Why did no one ever tell me about this?" Not that it mattered much, but it was a nice response. It made me feel good. And then he said, "You must tell Schultz." I said, "Set it up." And he said, "You'll have better luck getting an appointment if you try it yourself." And so I tried twice and was told Schultz didn't want to know about it. And so Schultz was then able to testify that nobody had told him what had happened, and because he'd so studiously managed it on his own initiative. And the best we can say about him at the end was that he knew too much to be innocent and too little to be Secretary of State. So it's a peculiar kind of administration, if you see what I mean. But these are the real problems which drive policy. So the combination of the real problems and the various psychological dilemmas in which the major actors found themselves combined to produce this catastrophe. Now let me give a few generalizations about Iran and Contras, and then I'll take your questions. It is clearly a fundamental mistake, no matter how neat one may think it is, to intermingle two separate policy issues. And this is really a law of policy. And it doesn't matter, even if the two are two of the most splendid things that you can imagine and are not in any apparent conflict with each other. To mix two things means that if something goes wrong in one, it's automatically going to reflect in the other. And sooner or later, you risk making a decision in one field based on the fact that it's linked to something else. This one, there is no logical linkage in the thing to start with. Now, in Iran and Contras, there is no logical reason why these two things should be subsumed under any one office in the American government. The reason why they came to be subsumed under one office, Ollie North's office, was because Ollie North was damn near the only person in the American government who could really get something done in the foreign policy field. And again, you have to think back to the kind of frustration that Haig had in trying to get anything done in terms of challenging the Soviet Empire for a year and a half. And by the time Ollie North became a phenomenon in the American government, it was the second term. End of the first term, beginning of the second. Late 84, early 85 is when he really emerges. And he doesn't really become a person to be reckoned with until after he's had this great success, which is the Achille Lauro affair. And that was really him. And there he demonstrated that it was possible for a lieutenant colonel with a relatively low status job in the National Security Council to come up with a great idea, to call the National Security Advisor, to get the National Security Advisor to say, okay, set it up, and within 5 hours coordinate every branch of the government to organize a fairly complicated paramilitary operation that then did succeed. And he became a real power in the American government because he showed that he could do things when nobody else could. And it was very instructive to watch that thing happen because it confirms almost all of the stereotypes that I had about the way the government worked. For once I was right. That is, all the way through the Achille Lauro affair, in the Situation Room in the White House, there was never a person from the State Department. Couldn't find one. They didn't show up. The only people in the room were NSC people and Pentagon people, and one member of the cabinet, aside from McFarlane, who had to be there because he worked there, and that was Meese. No Schultz, no Weinberger, no Casey. Meese. Because Meese cared about terrorism. It's exciting, and he wants to do something about it. So he showed up to see what was going on. Nobody else. And this whole thing was run at that level of the government. It was Ollie North and his equivalents in the Pentagon and the services. They were the ones who did it. So that it was logical in the end, when Ronald Reagan had these terrible problems, that he would turn to the one person who had proven that he could actually do something, and in one of the very few compartments of the government which had showed itself capable of keeping secrets. So let me just try to sum the whole thing up. Couldn't keep secrets. The president was passionate about hostages, wasn't basically interested in a broad global challenge to the Soviet Union or the Soviet Empire. Basic interest was in economics and taxation and things like that, not really engaged in foreign policy. You have a national security advisor under enormous psychological pressure, doesn't want to deal with these terribly complicated matters, so focuses on the hostage question, and then turns on this one, as he had earlier on the Contra matter, to the one person in the government who had showed that he could actually manage it. Well, it's a lot more complicated than that, and I'll deal with your questions. Let me just take one quick look at the current situation in the Gulf and give you 2 or 3 quick thoughts about it. Number one is that one always tries to recover from the last mistake. All right, generals are forever fighting the last war, journalists are always writing the last scoop, and foreign policy people are always recovering from the last debacle. Now, the last debacle in Iran was because we were trying to deal with the Iranians. So the one thing under no circumstances that anybody in Washington wants to do right now is deal with Iranians. So the Iranians now are the plague. Nobody wants to talk to them. So we talk to everybody else. And we have a foreign policy in the Gulf which is inexplicable on any rational basis. We are attacked by Iraq, to which we respond by declaring war on Iran. The basis for the policy is allegedly to defend the principle of free navigation in the Persian Gulf. But the country that has been violating that principle systematically all along is Iraq. It's an Iraqi policy to start attack the tankers and to sink the tankers, not an Iranian policy, because Iran ships and Iraq ships oil by pipeline. So for Iraq, it's fine to blow up tankers, and Iran doesn't want tankers being blown up. So in the name of an anti-Iranian policy, we are furthering Iran's foreign policy objectives in the name of declaring war against Iran. So that's a double reversal just at that stage of the analysis. Now, it's true that foreign policy is paradoxical, but this is really a bit too far. And behind it all, unfortunately, like it or not, remains the basic problem, which is called Iran. Iraq is strategically insignificant. It does not matter in the end of time which way Iraq goes. It matters profoundly which way Iran goes, because Iran is one of those cases about which somebody wrote, geography is destiny, because Iraq's role in the world is to be the buffer between Russia and the Persian Gulf. It has been that for 1,000 years, and God willing, it'll be that for another 1,000 years. That is where it is, and that is what it does. And there are 2 things that we do not want to happen. One is we don't want it to become a second Lebanon, so it disintegrates. Lebanon has already caused us enough trouble. Imagine Iran, which is a big country, and they fight even better than the Lebanese. And the second thing we don't want is for Iran to fall under greater Soviet control. And yet the policies which we are pursuing in the Gulf right now are seemingly designed to prevent us from achieving any of our basic strategic objectives in that part of the world, because we cannot possibly affect the situation in Iran if we don't deal with them one way or another. And if we're going to decide that the way to deal with Iran is going to be to declare war on them, then let's really declare war on them and not pretend to be fighting a war against them by taking target practice against little floating objects in the Persian Gulf. If you want to strike a blow against them, take out Kark Island and make them see that if they mess with the United States, there's a real price to be paid for it. Instead, we are where we have been all along. Define things rhetorically in order to make a good impression domestically. Don't do anything serious internationally, because that risks really becoming committed and doing things which may have a heavy cost. In the end, what we always find out, we found out with the Contras, and we're finding it out more and more every day with the case of Lebanon and Iran, the longer you wait, the worse it gets. Once you're convinced that you have a serious strategic problem, it pays to address it as early as possible and to avoid the basic mistake, which is the mistake of gradual escalation. If you want to solve it with military power, then you should figure out how much power is required to solve it and bring it to bear right away and try to do it right then and there. Thanks very much.
Let me ask a question about, based upon your comments about our Mideastern policy at the present time. Is there anyone in Iran to talk to?
I don't know, because I can't, unfortunately, I still don't have the answer to the question that I raised in 1985, which is, are there people in Iran who are both serious about talking about changing the regime and in a position to do it? So I don't know the answer. But yeah, anyway, we know that there are people in Iran who are interested in a dialogue with the West. Rafsanjani says he is. Montazeri always has been. So yeah, there's people to talk to.
I have two sets of questions. One is relating to the Shiites holding the hostages in Lebanon. I heard from one Shiite expert who tried to explain this to me, that the reason you say that the Iranians do have control, and he said that basically these are people who are related to the family of the Dawa prisoners in Kuwait, and they're never going to release all those hostages in Lebanon because they see them as cards with the United States in releasing the 17 Dawa prisoners in Kuwait. And I was wondering what you thought of that, basically meaning built in we cannot get the hostages out of Lebanon. And B, I was wondering how you can explain the policy debate going on now in Israel between Rabin and Peres over the Iran-Iraq war.
Well, on the first point, I've always been intrigued by this Dawa business, because I don't there are undoubtedly some people in Lebanon who have relatives in jail in Kuwait. But in all the time that I was dealing with the Iranians, they never once raised the question, ever, not a single time. Now, it's true that they apparently raised it with North later on, so maybe they intended to raise it all along, but not to a later stage in the discussions. But I was not struck by how important that was, and I think I'm absolutely convinced that Iran is in a position to obtain the release of all the hostages if they want it badly enough. So I think it depends not on the local Hezbollahis, but on the government of Iran in the end. And as for the debate between Rabin and Peres, it changes every month. But the basic question is that from Israel's standpoint, are radical Arab countries more dangerous than the radical Shiite revolutionary movements in Islam as a whole? All I can say is I'm glad we don't have these problems. I mean, they're both terrible. It's a question of whether you want to be destroyed by a griffin or a dinosaur, I suppose. And I don't know the answer. I think that it's a question of timing, because I think that the Pereses of the world are right when they say that eventually there has to be a sane Iran again. Revolutionary movements burn out after a while. There's a cyclical nature to these things. So somehow if Israel can wait long enough, they will get back the sort of Iran that they've always wanted.
That's Rabin, isn't it?
Is it Rabin?
That's the Rabin position.
Yeah.
That there's no Khomeinism after Khomeini.
Well, I mean, I personally disagree with that. I think there's plenty of Khomeinism after Khomeini, and I think it's going to take a generation to get rid of Khomeinism. I take revolutionary movements much more seriously. Yeah.
Thank you.
Over here.
Well, you painted a pretty ugly picture of how American politics operates dealing with foreign affairs, and I'm a little suspicious that there's a little more to the picture than just the operations of American foreign policy, because there's one thing that I'm curious about is how you take into account some of the allegations brought out in the Christic Institute lawsuit about the former Pentagon and CIA officials who are taking part in these subversive activities all around the world, such as Richard Secord, who not only was tied up with the Iran-Contra affair, but also was involved with the Nugan Hand Bank, which was set up starting in Australia and basically was laundering drug money so that money could be used to fund covert activities run by these former CIA and Pentagon officials. And all this just seems to feed into a design to create a parallel government to carry out another foreign policy. How do you take that into account?
I don't believe it. I think it's nonsense. And I do not know, I mean, the Christic Institute claims have been examined in detail by almost every Latin American correspondent that I know, both people who want to believe it and people who don't want to believe it, and nobody's been able to get any confirmation of it at all. Plus, I'll give you my own experience. I was on a panel with this man, Sheehan, who is their chief lawyer, and who's the author of this great theory of contemporary events. And he gave it to me, and the central figure in this story is a friend of mine by the name of Ted Shackley, whom Sheehan and the Christic Institute accuse of being really the keystone of all of this drug running and Contra support and so forth. So since Shackley said to me that he has nothing to do with Central America, nothing whatsoever in any way, shape, or fashion, I asked Sheehan, and this was at a public forum in New York to which you ought to be able to get the tape because he taped it. I said to him, suppose it turns out, for sake of argument, that Shackley has nothing to do with this story. And I said, I've never investigated this myself, but let's just say that he's telling the truth and he's not involved. Would that compel you to rethink your whole hypothesis? And he said, no, not at all. He said, it would simply mean that we're wrong about one person. And I said, careful with this, because what you're describing is not an empirical hypothesis, but some kind of religious conviction, because evidence doesn't shake it one way or the other. Now, I will tell you candidly that once I heard that from him, I tuned out, because anybody who looks at the world that way is someone who, for my money, there's just no intellectual discussion with such a person. It's that his theory is going to be true no matter what the evidence says. And since I can't find any responsible journalist who's been able to check out any piece of that theory, I've just given up on it. Now, it may turn out to be true in the end, but there's just no evidence for it. None. It just doesn't exist.
Over here.
Yeah.
Everything, the Christic Institute has a very strong record for proving things that people wouldn't have expected were true. No one would have thought that Kerr McGee would poison Karen Silkwood. Now, they didn't prove that the company killed her, but they did give $3 million for the company's negligence, and most of us really know that the company killed her on the way to her press conference with the New York Times. The Christic Institute has about a year until its case comes to court. They're in the process of making depositions now. When they took the deposition of one of their main witnesses in Canada recently.
Do you have a question?
Well, I want to know how you explain the fact that our covert people are breaking laws by, for instance, the main Christic, the way the case began was Ollie North and his buddies, the secret team, decided we'll have to get rid of this one Contra that isn't going along with our plans, Eden Pastora, because the Congress won't vote us any money unless we show that the Contras are together. So they got some C4 explosives, which you can only get if you have intelligence contacts.
Hey, you really should be careful, because before you go about accusing people of murder, which I take it is what you're doing.
Basically, yes.
Well, you ought to be able to show that he actually did it. And that's a case that I have investigated in some considerable detail, and I will tell you that based on all the evidence I have seen, I don't know who did it. The best candidate is this mysterious Basque, whoever it was. But there's certainly nothing that points in the direction of right-wing people trying to kill Pastore that I can find. Now, I will, the one part of this with which I do agree intensely, and did at the time, was that the people who did not want us, the people in the United States government who did not want to support Pastore were crazy, and that the decision to get rid of Pastore politically was about the stupidest thing that they could have done, because Pastore, I thought, was the one person in the Contra movement who really gave an indispensable legitimacy, political legitimacy, to the Contra phenomenon. And it was me and all my friends at the New Republic, well, you know them all, who did it. But again, to come back to the Christic Institute, and I really don't want to get into an endless discussion of the Christic Institute and its theories. What I want to stress to you about Christic Institute is two things. I'm willing to suspend judgment on it, and we'll wait the year, and we'll see what they develop in court. The two things that bother me about the Christic Institute is, number one, lots of journalists have been running around trying to confirm it. And if they have the evidence, they ought to be able to present it to a journalist who can find it himself or herself, and they haven't. So that's disturbing. Number two is Sheehan's personal performance, a person who says what he said about Shackley, who's central to his theory. And I am absolutely convinced that Shackley has nothing to do with this at all, nothing. And when I said to him, Dan, what happens if he just doesn't exist? You're just dead wrong about him. What happens to the theory? Nothing. That's crazy. That's irresponsible. So look out for it. Now, if it turns out that he's right, and I'll be the first one to grant it. But
We'll wait the year and see. I believe they will be shown right.
All right, we'll see.
What do you think are some major steps the American government can take to better the situation in the Persian Gulf?
Well, the first thing is to get ourselves out of a position where one boatload of crazies can drive us into a war with Iran. If we're going to fight a war with Iran, it ought to be under conditions of our choosing, time and place and method, and not put ourselves at the mercy of just some crazy people with some RPGs and a rowboat. So I want to get the fleet, at least to terms of combat that'll be understood, and get them out of a situation. I don't see why our policy in the Persian Gulf should be driven by the national interests of Kuwait. I just don't get that. This is a serious problem. And if Kuwait can or can't ship oil, I don't really care. If the Soviet Union wants to reflag Kuwaiti tankers, that's fine with me. Let them go fight Ayatollahs for a bit. It's great exercise for them. They have enough on their hands already with Afghanistan. So I want to get out of that mode. And I believe that we had the right position technically before on the war, which is one of strict neutrality. We want the war to end. Or if the war doesn't end, let it continue on this basis. The one thing we don't want is a war in which there's a winner and a loser. We don't want either Iraq or Iran to win the war, at least by my standards. So what I would like to do is to get the fleet out of the Gulf, to encourage the local countries to take the initiative to protect themselves. One gets sick and tired of acting on behalf of countries who won't let us do forward basing of materiel in that zone. We still need a rapid deployment force. Remember it? Well, probably you're too young, but back when Jimmy Carter was president, we had a great national debate about something called a rapid deployment force. So if somebody came and attacked the oil fields in the Middle East, we could respond. We still can't respond. We can't even respond to terrorist attacks in the Middle East, which is where almost all of them take place, and we need some place over there where we can put some counter-terrorist people and some equipment. Kuwait won't even let us do that. So I'm all for just saying to Kuwait, goodbye and good luck, and we'll buy your oil if it's at a reasonable price, and pursue some kind of rational policy with regard to Iran. I think we have to play there.
Two questions, one concerning you and then one on your comments dealing with Ghorbanifar. One of the things that Europeans have been talking about a lot the last couple of years in various newspapers has been these accusations of Francesco Pazienza from from the Italian military intelligence that you had been receiving payments from the Italian and the Spanish governments to peddle influence within the Reagan administration.
He never said that.
Well, that's what.
See, this is another case in which I'm happy to answer any question you have to ask. Okay. But please make sure that you've got it right.
All right. Well, maybe you could comment then on the Billy Gates scandal before the Reagan administration came to power. Now, in the newspapers, I've seen they say you received $120,000 in payments plus expenses to help put this story together and exposing the Carter administration. It has appeared, several places, and I've been told you dispute the figures, but you don't deny that you've received the payments.
No, what I say is that I'd be delighted to acknowledge it if only somebody would find it for me, and I've offered all these journalists 50-50 split if they just find this money, because I have 3 children going to school and could desperately use it. I haven't seen it. That's all I've said. So if somebody paid it, I haven't got it, and I'd like it. So let's go. Give me the bank account number, and we'll go have a party. That's number one. Number two, the whole Billy Gates story, the accusation is one of the biggest jokes of all time, since the Billy Gates story was a major international scandal 6 months before Arnaud de Bourggraff and I started to work on it. Our article, if you actually sit down and read it, contains 2 basic elements. The first is an extended conversation with a series of Libyan defectors in Western Europe, describing what Gaddafi was up to at that point, because we were examining why Gaddafi was trying to be nice to Billy Carter. And point 2, which was the only really new elements in the story, was that we discovered that Billy Carter had met with Habash and Arafat. And that was new. But that's the only thing that was new, and he confirmed it. So I'm goddamned if I'm about to apologize for having written a story which was substantially correct, which was based on solid information, which ran, yes, in 8 or 9 publications around the world. It wasn't what anybody said it was. Billy Gates existed long before us. And a story for which we got our normal payment for a story, pure and simple.
Okay, just one quick follow-up. I mean, you mentioned the Libya thing, and you seem to have a certain amount of trust in Gabanafar. Now, it's been said that he was the one who said that there were all these Libyan hit squads loose in the country that were going to hit Reagan. Now, just one point of information. Last month I was in Berlin, and we were told it was the disco bombing that was the reason that we had to take out Libya with the bombing. You very much applauded that action, but you wished there was a lot more bombing in Libya.
I often joke that you'd think that he even cared about a journalist being held hostage in Moscow, something you'd expect him to have celebrated under the circumstances. And instead, even Danilov got his attention. How to improve things? There is no short cure for our national problems. The basic reason why we don't have people who know enough about the world is because the educational system's lousy. I mean, you all know the test scores and so forth of people who are quizzed about geography and history and so forth. The last one of these horrifying things, they can't really be all true, but sophomores at University of South Carolina, which is a plenty good university, believe me, more than half of them could not place the date of the Civil War within 50 years. I mean, it seems impossible, doesn't it? But that's what it said. So let's say it's only 30% of them who can't place the Civil War within half a century. It's terrifying. People know nothing about the world. Well, products of this educational system cannot be magically transformed into terrific foreign policy people simply by sitting in the Department of State or the National Security Council. If you know nothing, that's what you're going to know. And I think it's Kissinger who pointed out that basically in these jobs, the cultural baggage you bring in is the cultural baggage you take out, because the only time you have to learn there is to learn operational things about how to work the bureaucracy, how to write a proper memorandum, who your enemies are in the other agencies, and how to defeat them and outwit them and so forth. But in terms of basic understanding of reality, there really aren't hours in the day for you to pick that kind of stuff up. So the basic thing is we need better educated Americans. That's number one. Number two is we need accountability in the system across the board. As it stands right now, no one is accountable for what he or she does on the most fundamental level. There is no reward for taking risk and succeeding, and there is no punishment for doing nothing and failing. So you have to have incentives, and you have to have some kind of punishment for failure. There has to be some kind of accountability. And number three, I suppose, is that somehow we've got to find it possible to recruit talented people into government who don't fall into the two categories from which today most political appointees come, which is either people who are so rich that they can afford the government salaries, or people who are so low on the totem pole that they think that what they're getting is actually an improvement.
Over here.
Could you comment whether you thought it was a good idea to actually try to strike a deal for hostages?
That was a terrible idea.
But that was your assignment?
No, my assignment was to study Iran, paradoxically, and I then, I went to Israel in May of 1985 to ask Peres if the Israelis knew anything about Iran, and if so, would they share it with us, because we were interested in Iran generally, and we found that we knew nothing. So Peres then set up what you'd call a study group inside his government to share with me the information that Israel had on Iran, and we set one up in Washington to exchange information, and it was about this time that Ghorbanifar emerged. So I happened to be there when he came forward with all these various initiatives, and I was the intermediary for the first several months and attended these meetings, and from time to time would speak up and tell people what I thought about things. And what I said was I thought that we should get out of the hostage business as quickly as possible and worry about these political problems. And that is probably why people started inventing rumors about me around about the late fall of 1985 that I was taking money and that I was removed from this thing by the end of November. By the way, just for those who remain interested in my finances, I've now been investigated. All my finances for the last 10 years have now been gone over by the special prosecutor, the select committees, the FBI, the IRS, not only my finances, but my children's finances, including Daniel, who turned 1 a week ago. And they still can't find it. So the choices are two. Either I never got it, which is what I think, or whoever gave it to me hid it so carefully that not even these people can find it. So it's one or the other. Yeah.
We've heard a lot of disturbing information about the president. And you obviously work close to the president if you haven't actually dealt with him. I'm just wondering what the insider's view is on Ronald Reagan. Is he actually in touch? And does he work longer hours than the press says?
No, he doesn't work longer hours than the press says. I'm not sure that working long hours is indispensable to being a good president. And I say this in all honesty. I don't know. I'm no longer as sure as I used to be about what one wants in a president, although I will say, only being slightly more provocative than I normally try to be, that Reagan, in terms of his style of presidency, comes pretty close to being ideal by my standards. That is to say, I want a forest president, not a trees president. I was forced to choose between a Reagan-style president and a Carter-style president. Carter just got always totally immersed in every detail of every decision and so forth. 100 times better to have a Reagan. Problem with Reagan, from my standpoint, is that, number one, he doesn't know much of anything about the world, but that's true of almost any politician. You know, the system is designed to give us people who know nothing about the world, and even that isn't automatically a solution, because Cyrus Vance, who knew a great deal about the world, turned out to be probably the worst Secretary of State of the 20th century. And I mean, he certainly knew. Knowing isn't enough. So now, of all the people who are running, there's only one person who really knows, and that's Bush, and he really knows. I mean, Bush has done everything. There is no job that he hasn't held except the number one job, and he's superbly informed, and he superbly understands all of these things. Does he fill you with enthusiasm? No. And you're looking for someone interesting. What you need in the presidency, and you can always get somebody who knows to be Secretary of State. You don't need him to be president. What you want to be president, I think, anyway, and I know that it sounds crazy, especially coming from an intellectual, but you don't want an intellectual as president. That's catastrophe. Don't want it. You want somebody with sound instincts, with the basic understanding about the world, but someone who doesn't want to spend too much time involved in the details, and basically a guy who knows the parameters within which he wants policy to function and knows what he wants. The basic problem with Reagan is that in foreign policy, he has some feelings, but he doesn't have objectives. And in the end, his political prudence and the people around him who say, you know, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, it's dangerous, wait, sunk an awful lot of opportunities. The United States had an unbelievable opportunity at the beginning of the Reagan administration. We still have a terrific opportunity. We're faced with a Soviet system that's collapsed across the board. And in fact, one can make a case right now, if you want to be more general about the thing, that we have won outright. And the whole reason why Gorbachev is behaving the way he's behaving is because he's beginning to think that he's doomed. And the only chance he has is that we're going to bail him out. I mean, look at the Soviet position right now. Out of money. Oil prices are going to drop even more now, thanks to the wonderful Iranians. Diamonds aren't bringing in the money that they used to. Eastern Europe is in complete collapse. Romania may fall from one week to the next, and who can blame them facing their second winter with no heat and no light and no electricity? It's unbelievable. They've gone back to a pre-medieval condition under Ceausescu. Right? Poland's rejected glasnost. Czechoslovakia says they want it, but it's a basket case. Hungary, which was the model of the new socialism, is a failure and is now in virtual default. The Soviets can't pay off any of these debts. Afghanistan is in big trouble. They had a desperate offensive in Angola and lost. Nicaragua is not setting any world records for anything except misery in Latin America. Where are they going? And here this president sits there and smiles and says, well, we'll make friends. There's a whole new era opening. I mean, an aggressive anti-communist would say there is a new era opening marked by the collapse of the communist system because all the symptoms are there. And the president who took foreign policy seriously would be scratching his head right now saying, how are we going to manage the collapse of the Soviet Empire? Because that's scary. We don't know how to manage it, and a lot of thought has to be given to it. Well, anyway.
This will be our last question.
You mentioned the existence of these Iranian dissidents assessed by Gorbanifar. Could you tell us more about these people? Who were they? Were they merchants? Were they from the bazaar? Were they religious people? Were they? And then, in your opinion, what would be which kind of policy you would have support in that respect regarding the American scenario? Do you think that the United States should have support a kind of overthrowing the regime with these dissidents, supporting these dissidents?
Well, look, in general, my view of what the United States should do in foreign policy is to support democratic revolution. That is what I am for. And I tend to be quite active on that. So I think if we could, if it turned out that there were a better option in Iran, Iranians who would be better than the present ones and wanted a bit of support from us, I think that we, if that checked out, that we should have been inclined to do that, yes. Who they were, they provided me with a long list of names of people who they said agreed with them and would support them in what they were doing, and it was a cross-section of the institutions of contemporary Iranian society. The people with whom I met were extremely high-ranking people in the regime. These are not people from the bazaar or people from remote tribes. They were people from Tehran in positions of real power today, so that one could take seriously, in theory at least, to claim from them that they were going to try to change things. Were they serious about doing it? And if serious, would they have been in a position to do anything about it? Don't know. Can't answer it.
Thank you.